When I was a child, I thought, I talked, and I acted like a child. I was taught to believe in heaven and hell. I was taught to believe in God and the devil. I was taught to believe in Christmas and Easter, Santa Claus, and the Easter Bunny. But when I became a man, I outgrew my childish thinking, and I replaced my childish ways with knowledge, with insight, as I fulfilled my desire to know. I came to realize that neither Santa Claus nor the Easter Bunny were real. I came to understand that originally Christmas and Easter had nothing to do with the birth, the death, and the resurrection of a man named Jesus. I learned through research that the letter J was invented around 400 years ago, and that Jesus wasn't the name of the person that we call Jesus. I learned that God and the devil were ideas, were concepts, were opposite aspects of the same entity, of the same force. I learned that heaven and hell were conditions that exist on earth, not above it, not below it, but conditions that exist on earth in real time right now. Came to understand that religions were invented by men in an attempt to codify spiritual systems which existed thousands of years earlier. My understanding of spirituality has taught me that we are spiritual beings who have come here to have a human experience. We made a decision to come here in this life. I've come to understand that life is not a linear experience. We don't just live and then die and that's it. But life, by studying nature, is cyclical. Life follows patterns of birth, life experience, death, ancestorhood, rebirth. It is a cycle, an ongoing cycle. Now I've learned that if you learn to use your spiritual power, the power that dwells within each and every person, then you have the capacity, you have the ability to experience heaven here on earth. If you don't know how to use it, every day of your life will be filled with hell and misery. But you have a choice. Only if you know that you have a choice. Only if you know how to use the choices available to you in order to utilize that creative force that works through us. My understanding of religions, particularly Judaism and Christianity, has taught me that true knowledge of spirit has intentionally been withheld from the masses of people, so that we will be subjected to the control of a handful of people who manipulate us through fear and ignorance. One of the greatest tricks ever played on humanity was to convince them that they only go around once in life, that you were born in sin, and somebody had to die to alleviate your sin, and that if you follow this person and their teachings, then you will spend eternity in heaven, and if you don't, you'll spend eternity in hell. When, based on my research, I've learned most ministers that I've talked to, I've had a lot of conversations with ministers in private and off the record, they would tell me that they don't believe in heaven and hell. They know that what they tell the members of their congregation on Sunday morning is something that they don't even believe in. I've been to Kemet with enough ministers who have seen in the Nile Valley the African origins of everything they talk about within their Bible. And I've asked them in private conversations, well, how are you going to share this information with your congregation when you return? And they have all told me to a person, man, if I share this information on Sunday, I'll be looking for a job on Monday. I tell people what they want to hear. So it's all a matter of conditioning. And when people can begin to condition themselves to understand greater truths, then maybe the people who stand before you on Sunday can begin to present those greater truths to you so that you can begin to control your life your community and your destiny instead of praying to others to do for you what you've always had the capacity to do. This is the challenge that we're faced with. What's important is that for the last 1,600 years, a world has been shaped. Our perception of the world, our perception of reality, has been shaped by European explorers, colonizers, and enslavers. And they have historically used the Bible and the sword to conquer indigenous people all over this earth and to teach them to worship a God who looked like their conquerors. This action was initiated by Constantine, the first Christian emperor of Rome, who wasn't even a Christian. If you read the stories about Constantine, he was a Christian emperor, but he was not a Christian himself, who in 312 ACE, on the eve of a major battle, had a vision. And in this vision, God came to him and said that he would grant Constantine victory if he fought under the sign of the cross. And so Constantine had all of his soldiers paint on their shields the Greek letters chi and rho. The Greek letters chi and rho are the first two letters in the word Christ. And they fought under the banner of Christ, and they were victorious. Now, they used the letters chi and rho because the letter J had not been invented at that point in time. All right, let's put all of the dots together so that when we connect them, we understand what we see. Constantine was victorious in his battle, and he discovered a weapon that was more powerful than any nuclear weapon. Constantine discovered the power of theological warfare, and he conquered people in the name of God. And he imposed upon those that he conquered, who had different beliefs, this idea that if you didn't worship my God, then I was justified to do whatever I want to you. If you were a pagan, if you were an infidel, I could kill you, I could rape you, I could rob from you, I could do whatever I wanted to do because you were not a believer in my God. Now, it's important to realize and understand some of these definitions. Pagan is not necessarily a negative thing. The word pagan simply means somebody who worships a God different from yours. That's all pagan means. So to a Jew, a Christian is a pagan. To a Muslim, Jews and Christians are pagan. They simply worship a God different than their own. There's nothing bad or derogatory or evil about that word if you understand it in its correct context. Every European conqueror, from Columbus to Cortez to Washington, engaged in theological warfare. And each of these men violated the very commandments that they taught their slaves to adhere to. America is a Christian nation because America was founded by Christians who stole the land from the indigenous people, who murdered and who enslaved others, and taught those that they conquered, those that they enslaved, to believe in a doctrine that they did not adhere to themselves. And of course, these issues are never brought up in school. They're seldom brought up or discussed in church. It's something that we're just supposed to look the other way when it comes to. Act as if it didn't exist. And so it's important for us to begin to cultivate a different relationship with Spirit, a different relationship with the Creator, if we are to change the quality of our lives here in this country or anywhere else on earth. The study of history reveals that European world dominance is on the decline. Europeans are losing their control as people of color begin to assert themselves globally. And for the first time in history, for the first time in the last 2,000 years, the majority of Christians are non-European. That's one of the reasons why Pope John Paul II has traveled more to Africa than all of the popes combined. He's traveled more to South America than all of the popes combined, because he knows that the future of Catholicism is in people of color. So they are proselytizing and working overtime to see to it that they will have new members to keep them in power. In light of the imminent shift of world power and consciousness, European theologians and scholars have been devising new ways to consolidate their power. And for decades, they have been meeting behind closed doors. I remember at least 15, almost 20 years ago, hearing Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark in a conversation talk about a meeting, a conference that was held by Jewish theologians here in New York, where they talked about the origins of the Torah. And they talked about all the myths and the symbolism that was in this text, and how it was not a text to be taken literally. And that for some reason or another, there was never any documentation about this conference that was released. But if you read the popular literature, many of the major national magazines, Time, Newsweek, U.S. News and World Report, if you notice over the last 5 years, you've been seeing a plethora of cover stories that are re-evaluating religion, re-evaluating Jesus the Christ, re-evaluating Moses, re-evaluating the concept of heaven and hell. There's this conversation that is going on behind closed doors that is now slowly being introduced to the general public. Why? What does that mean? It means that you are slowly being prepared for a bombshell that is going to be dropped in the very near future. And people are positioning themselves so that once this new information comes out, you can continue to look to them for continued leadership. I reference specifically an article that was published just this year, March of this year, in Harper's Magazine. The article was entitled "False Testament: How Archaeology Refutes the Bible's Claim to History." And it's written by Daniel Lazari, a Jewish writer who cited the latest biblical archaeological research that refutes the Old Testament. And let me just share with you some of the highlights that were in this article, because it's so profoundly significant. It's significant because of the fact that it hasn't been talked about in the general community, but others are beginning to talk about it more openly. Some of the points that he raised in this article is that Israelites, who are now thought to have been an indigenous culture that developed west of the Jordan River around 1200 BCE, and they did not originate in Mesopotamia as they claim. There is no archaeological evidence to support the fact that they immigrated to that area called Palestine from elsewhere. Another important point, and this one hits right at the heart of the matter, that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and other tribal founders depicted in the book of Genesis, and this is his quote, a direct quote, were no more real than the gods of Greece or Norse mythology. That they were not real personalities. These are Jews telling their story to the world. They also said that Moses never existed. I want you to understand this. They are saying that Moses never existed, and that the Israeli flight from Egypt never occurred. Understand what they're saying. So it's in, you can find it in Harper's Magazine, March 2000. Very interesting story. And this whole story was derived from a new Torah that was published in November of last year called the Et Hayim, or the Tree of Life. It was published by the United Synagogue of Conservative Jews. And in this Torah, they added in the commentary the latest archaeological research that refutes the Old Testament. Now, an interesting thing about biblical archaeology is that it's a science that's about 100 years old, and it was originally created in order to bolster the credibility of the Bible. But specifically within the last 25 years, the physical evidence has said that what existed in this book is not a fact, are now seen as, quote, an invention of Jerusalem-based priests in the 7th and 8th century BCE. Solomon and David were not the great kings that they were purported to have been in the Old Testament. They also said that the walls of Jericho, Joshua in the Battle of Jericho, well, they said that based on the archaeological evidence, the wall was only 2 feet high at the time that the Joshua came there, and had been destroyed for at least 70 years prior to his conquest of that land. So the myths, the stories that we have been given are now have to be viewed through a different pair of eyes in light of the evidence that is now being allowed to circulate among the general public. And so the challenge for us is, how do you process that information? Do you categorically deny it and throw it away simply because it challenges everything that you've been taught? Or do you begin to read it and study it to understand the truth that may be in this information? It's important to understand it. Another profound statement in this new Torah was that Genesis, the book of Genesis, was, again, quoting from them, an artificial construct. It was a narrative framework created long after the facts in order to link together a series of unconnected folk tales like pearls on a string. In other words, they made it up. In other words, they made it up. And so, understand the domino effect that we're dealing with. If Genesis was a fabrication, which they say it was, then it means that God didn't create the world in 7 days, or their God did not create the world in 7 days. It meant that their God did not create Adam and Eve, and they were never expelled from Eden, which means then that there was no original sin, and there was no reason for anybody to come back and die for sins that you never committed in the first place. As religion is being reevaluated, we're hearing more and more talk about spirituality. We're hearing more and more talk about different ways to know the Creator. So we're hearing more about indigenous people here in this land, indigenous people in Africa, indigenous people in the Pacific Islands, South America, and how they relate to the Creator. And so it's important for us to take all of this information and look at it and evaluate it from an African-centered context. If we do that, then at least we'll be starting off on the right foot. Looking at this information from an African-centered context means that we have to first accept the fact that humanity began first in Africa. Matter of fact, there was an article published just this last Tuesday that stated that archaeologists have found what they believe to be the oldest human skull, 7 million years old, in Chad in Central Africa. So as they do more of the archaeological research, what they're beginning to realize is they don't know how long humans have been on this planet, but the greatest evidence for the existence of humanity can only be found in Africa. So Africa is the place where everything begins. So we have to begin to see Africa through different eyes. Since Africa was the birthplace of humanity, we also have to acknowledge the fact that Africa is the birthplace of civilization. And Dr. Ben has devoted his life to teaching us about the Nile Valley origins of civilization. And it's in the Nile Valley where you can find the first organized method of relating to a force more powerful than you, an unseen force. There were literally thousands of texts that were written by our ancestors thousands of years ago that talked about ways of cultivating a relationship with this force so that you could empower yourself, because they knew something that we've forgotten. You know, what's interesting, let me just share this with you. I've been traveling to Kemet for 22 years, and have probably been there maybe about 35, 36 times. You know, the first couple of times you go, you know, you're very excited about being there, and you're tripping out on the fact that, oh, we were here and we built this and we did that. But after you get past all of that and realize that the Arabs control this land and we ain't never getting it back. And we ain't never getting it back, all right? But there's a lot there that we can study. that we can examine. And once I began to accept that reality and began to take my time walking through the temples, looking at the columns, and imagining the architectural energy that went into creating it, the engineering skills that went into designing it, all the artists and craftspersons that were responsible for building these temples that have stood for thousands and thousands of years. And I began to see this place, or try to see this place through the eyes of the people who created it when it was brand new. And doing that made me realize that we, so-called modern human beings, are literally functioning on a subhuman level. That the people who created this ancient culture and civilization knew how to manifest the aspects of God, the creator, whatever term you want to use. They knew how to manifest that knowledge within themselves so that they literally created heaven on earth. And when you walk through these temples and see the monuments, you will see the handiwork of people who knew how to manifest God within them, and they built for eternity. That's one of the reasons why Europeans over the last 3,000 years have been trying to claim Kemet for themselves. Because it is there where you can find the record of what men and women did when they were more closely connected to the creative force than we could ever imagine. And that's a model for us to aspire to recreate in our minds, in our hearts, and in our lives today. Meta Nature wasn't just a form of communication. Meta Nature, God's words or God's writings, was a ideographic form of communication which used symbols that represented ideas as opposed to letters, which mean nothing until they're strung together in a series that they form words, and words in a series form sentences, and sentences form concepts and ideas. But each component of Meta Nature was a symbol, was a complete thought, and a spiritual force in and of itself. It is a different way of connecting with a source of power, which is one of the reasons why when they wrote the language, they didn't write it in vowels. They never wrote with vowels. Why? Because vowels, A-E-I-O-U, vibrate at a rate 600 times faster than consonants. Vowels, when properly placed in between consonants, give power to those words and are able to bring into manifestation from the spiritual realm whatever it is you focus your energy on creating. This concept was so powerful that they did not insert the vowels, because not just anybody could handle this power, this force, this knowledge. You had to be trained. You had to go through an educational process that endured for over 40 years before you were qualified to begin to speak it, to write it, to use words, to bring creation into the physical form. So if you look at others who have copied from us, who have stolen from us, they tried as best they could to emulate some of these same principles, concepts, and ideas. So when you look at the Hebrew alphabet, which was derived from Meta Nature, you'll notice that Hebrew, like Meta Nature, does not have vowels, only consonants. And if you study, if you read a Torah and read the commentary of the words, each character has a profound meaning. And when you string these characters together to form words, and you are writing on a symbolic level, a level that is, you're writing and you're communicating with a spiritual force that the average person knows nothing about. This knowledge, this power was derived from Kemet. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on how you want to look at it, these people who created the Hebrew alphabet didn't have all the clues, didn't have all the keys. They had enough to overpower those who had nothing, but they had nothing in comparison to the true source of that knowledge and information. The tradition, if you look at Meta Nature, many of the characters in Meta Nature come directly from nature, objects that were in your immediate environment. It is from the word nature, which means principle or aspect of the divine. It is from the word nature that we have derived the word nature. So when looking at the Creator's creations and using them as a modality for writing, thinking, and speaking, you could begin to tap into this creative power and bring things into manifestation as well. But you had to understand the power in the words. You had to go through a process to be trained to speak correctly, to write correctly, so that you did not abuse this relationship with the Creator or their power. The spiritual philosophy was based on a view of the cosmos as the domain of the divine. And since human beings were a part of the cosmos, human beings were also divine. Divinity exists within us. As human beings, we never fell from grace. We are never disconnected from the Creator. We can always begin to reconnect if we know how. African spirituality teaches us that we are spiritual beings who are currently having a divine human experience. And when you know who you are, then you can use this knowledge, you can use this language, you can use this speech to build, to add to your character, to add to your community, as opposed to exploiting others. Rituals were designed in order to maintain connections between community and the spirit. African spiritual traditions teaches that spirit manifests itself in everything. The Creator, the creative God created the world and everything in the world, and it means that everything that we see, everything that we touch, contains within it aspects of that creation. So if you look at things with the right eye, when you see them, you see the Creator in those things. If you look at your brother and your sister and know that the Creator exists within them, then when you communicate with them, you don't communicate with bitches and hoes. You're communicating with God. And so when you talk, you all should be having a higher form of communication so that the God in you can communicate with the God in the other person. And you can transform your consciousness through a higher level of communication. That's what we have to get back to. Africans believe that all life is ritual. All life is ritual. And rites of passages helped us move from one phase of life to the other, if life is cyclical. And as you move through this circle, you move from one phase of physical development, one phase of mental development, one phase of spiritual development into another, into another, into another. And each phase of development requires that you learn, that you master new information, and that you prove yourself to be proficient in the utilization of this information before you can move to the next level. It's all designed to raise your consciousness so that you can give back to those within your community. And so we go through this process. We move from spirit to birth, to maturation, to adulthood, to death, to ancestorhood, to spirit, and to rebirth. This is the cycle of life. And while much of this information has been lost, has been stolen, has been distorted, there are occasions when we can get glimpses of this knowledge. And I cite, for example, the book Spirit of Intimacy, written by Sambofu Somé, the wife of Malidoma Somé, who's from Burkina Faso. And she talks about a ritual that they have within their community, a ritual called the hearing ritual, where when a woman is pregnant, she goes to see a priest. And a priest engages this pregnant woman in this ritual that is designed to allow the mother to communicate with the spirit of the ancestor that is in her womb. And through this ritual, the mother not only communicates with this ancestor in her womb, but she understands, she knows who that ancestor is, that is, who is now coming back through her to be born into the community to continue the work that they left undone. So knowing who is coming back means that you know who this person is. You know what their destiny is in life. You know what name to give this child. So that when this child is born, there are other components of this ritual. So when this child is born, you take that object that was the object that belonged to the ancestor that they have come back as, and you bury that object at a specific location. And when that child reaches a certain age, 13 or 14, that child is to go to find that object that was buried. And when that child retrieves that object, it is confirmation that that ancestor has returned. This is a ritual that has been going on for thousands of years. It means that these Africans in Burkina Faso understand aspects of life and death and rebirth that we have forgotten or have not been allowed to understand. What's also interesting is if you read her husband's book, Malidoma Some's book, his first book, Of Water and the Spirit, he talks about this spiritual relationship that existed between his father, who was the chief priest of his village, and other priests who worked with him. Wonderful, fascinating account of African spirituality and how Africans develop individuals and community based on their understanding of who they were. An important part of this book is the story of French priests coming into the village, stealing children, taking the children away to monasteries where they were taught to forget their pagan ways, taught the Bible so that they can come back and convert their family members to Christianity. Malidoma as a child was stolen and spent a number of years in one of these monasteries. And he talked about, this book is about 10 years old, and he talked in this book about things that were happening in this monastery that I've been reading in newspapers for the last 3 or 4 months, about little boys being raped, little boys being molested by teachers of God. But the fascinating part of the story, he talks about when he leaves, when he escapes and goes back into his community and the choices that were given to him by the elders in his community as to what he needed to do in order to reinsert himself into the community, the rituals that he had to go through. So the book is fascinating because it deals with aspects of African spirituality that we've not had the opportunity to read about from an indigenous African people. So it's important for us to realize that we do have access to knowledge and information that can help us put the pieces of this puzzle together and understand who we are. Because one of the challenges in talking about religion and deconstructing the Bible is that people instinctively would draw back when you try to take away their Jesus. I mean, that's a natural reaction because everybody needs something to believe in. Everybody needs a foundation upon which to stand. But what I'm sharing with you, brothers and sisters, is that there are foundations out there. You have to take the initiative to begin to do the research, to read, to study, and begin to incorporate this information in your life. What's important about Africans who were enslaved here in America is that we were separated from these teachings, and we were not allowed to bring them over here or to practice. We were not allowed. Another important component is that Africans were enslaved in America for 200 years before their European enslavers decided to begin to teach enslaved Africans Christianity on a wholesale basis. What's important about this decision was that it came on the heels of insurrections. And as the Europeans became more and more afraid of insurrections, they decided that they needed to do something in order to keep those black folk docile and quiet. And so decisions were made to introduce them and to bring them into the Christian fold. There's a very important book that you all need to get your hands on and read. I was introduced to it by a minister in Washington, D.C., one of the few African-centered ministers in D.C., Reverend Willie Wilson, who wrote a book entitled Releasing the Power Within Through Spiritual Dynamics. And he references this effort that was made in 1842 to introduce enslaved Africans to Christianity. It was a book written by a preacher by the name of Reverend C.C. Jones, who in 1842 wrote a book entitled Oral Instructions, the Oral Religious Instructions of the Negroes in the United States. He documents in this book the fear of the white enslavers of insurrections and how Christianity can be used to contain them and keep them docile. And he literally met with ministers. He met with groups of enslavers to share this philosophy with them in order to maintain the status quo. And he outlined specific things, specific outcomes that could be expected by introducing your enslaved population to the Christian Bible. He said specifically, you would teach them through oral instructions, since they were not allowed to read, teach them through oral instructions that God ordained slavery for the heathen African. So they stress, and he specifically cited all of the passages in the Bible where slavery was justified by Moses, by God, by all of these personalities, so that the Africans could begin to see that, yeah, I'm supposed to be here because this is where God wants me to be. He said you could also use Christianity to teach the enslaved Africans that God ordained whites in America to be their slave masters. This was the purpose behind this indoctrination. And again, it took place on a wholesale level in this country in 1842. Another point that he made is that since God ordained whites to enslave Africans, then Christianity must not interfere with this divine relationship. All right? So you can begin to understand why the Klan, why other white Christians would burn a cross when they lynched black people, why there was always this relationship between the Bible and religious activities as they were killing other people. That to me seemed to be a violation of the very laws within this book. But the way that it was constructed was that God said it was all right for white folk to do whatever they wanted to do to these heathen Africans. Another important point that he used to sell this idea of introducing Christianity to enslaved Africans was that if you give Africans Sunday off, they don't have to work on Sunday, and you spend that day teaching them this information and allow them to congregate as a group, then they will learn to accept poverty, pain, and enslavement on earth because they know that they will get their reward in the next life. Huh? That's not an accident. This is a cold-blooded, calculated design in order to keep a group of people subservient to others. Reverend Jones said that the immediate benefits to the enslaver were introducing Christianity to the enslaved would be the one, slaves would be more obedient to their masters. Because God said, yeah, this is how the relationship is supposed to be. The Christian morality would reduce rebelliousness. It would create instead a cheerful motivation, industry, domestic virtue, submission to authority, and peaceful service to the master. All right? This was the intent. And did it work? Is it still working? We have to understand why. As more and more black ministers begin examining how Christianity has been used as a tool for white supremacists to control the destiny of African people throughout the world, and as they begin to examine the African presence within the Bible, we got to do more than just put a black face on former white faces. We got to do more than say, well, the Bible is a book about black people. We've got to study how this book was constructed in the very first place. Why those images were put there. And the power behind doing that. So let me just take a minute to deconstruct aspects of Christianity, to look at the symbolic aspects, and to extract this African essence so that we can begin to understand what we are seeing. If we examine the African origins of Christianity, we will see that the Holy Bible is literally Helios Biblios, or the Sun Book, the book of the sun. The book of the Son of God, and the book of the sun, Helios, the sun, the symbol for the Creator. In Kemet, they had multiple names for the sun, the symbol of the Creator. Different names that express the power of the sun or the power of the Creator at different points in time during the day. When the sun was born in the morning in the east, it was called Kepra. When the sun reached its highest point at noon, it was called Ra, or Re. And when the sun descended in the evening, it was called a Tun, which meant the hid, which meant conceal, which meant that even though you can't see the Creator, you know that the creative force is still there. You know that it is all pervasive, and you know for a fact that it is going to be reborn tomorrow morning when it rises in the east as Kepra. So they had a profound way of codifying the Creator and the various manifestations of the Creator. Another important aspect of this is that sun rises in the east, it's Kepra, it reaches its highest point at noon, and that is when it is said that the sun or the Creator is on high. When the sun is at noon, that is when it is at its meridian, at its highest point. So the sun at noon, or God on high, is the most spiritually empowering time of day. All right? Most spiritually empowering time of day. And so the time before the Creator comes on high, noon, then that time is referred to, when the sun is at the meridian, that time is referred to as ante-meridian, or before the meridian, or AM. The time after the sun has moved from on high, is now descending, is referred to as post-meridian, or PM, after it's reached its highest point. So these positionings of the sun are critically important if you're to understand this different form of energy, the different manifestations of energy as it moves across the sky during the day, during the month, and during the year. Because the energy changes throughout the day, throughout the month, throughout the year. The Holy Bible is a book of astrotheology. Astrotheology. Astro means star. Theology means God. So the Holy Bible is a book about star knowledge, or knowledge of the sun, and the significance of the relationship with the sun. The significance of the relationship between the sun and the earth is visible during specific times of year, because we see in the wintertime, when the sun rises low in the horizon, everything is dead in the northern hemisphere. Cold, nothing grows. But come the spring, when the length of the sun begins to increase, then what happens? Life begins to spring forth from the black earth. So the more the sun is present in your life, the more life you see on earth. So there's a direct relationship between the amount of light that you receive from the sun, from the Creator, from God, and activities on planet Earth. And it's constantly changing. Once you understand these changes, then you can begin to synchronize your activities with the activities of the sun. And you literally begin to put yourself in sync with God, in sync with the universe. Another important concept that I'll just share with you briefly, so profoundly important to me, is the fact that our ancestors, ancient African ancestors, studied the sun, studied the stars and the planets. And based upon this study, they divided the day into 24 hours. They divided the year into 365 and a quarter days. They created the concept of time, which meant that they knew that there was a time for everything. Everything in the universe happens on time. And when you were conscious of the specific energy that's emanating from the sun at a specific point in time in the day and the month of the year, when you're using that knowledge, then you will experience a different reality from someone else who has no knowledge of this relationship. Everything happens on time. So it's my firm belief that this thing that we call CP time literally puts us out of sync with the universe with the Creator, with God. And you all know as well as I do, when you are out of sync with the universe, with the Creator, with God, ain't nothing coming your way. So we've got to begin to see time differently and use time differently in order to bring things into manifestation. Significant portions of the Bible were derived from the so-called books of the dead, the Peret Heru, the chapters of coming forth into daylight, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, and the books of Jehudi. These texts were co-opted by Europeans, specifically at the Council of Nicea in 332 ACE, when Constantine made Christianity the official state religion of Rome. He convened a meeting of approximately 300 bishops to determine the contents of their holy book. They debated the framework for celebrating Easter. They established Christmas 18 years after the Council of Nicea, or 350 years after the birth of Jesus the Christ. Christmas was celebrated. What was that all about? It was all designed specifically to keep those people with competitive religious and spiritual views under your control. Because for thousands of years before Christmas was an official Christian celebration, December the 25th was celebrated by indigenous people throughout the world as the time frame of the birth of the sun. And if you've ever read John Jackson's Introduction to African Civilization, there's a section in the book where he talks about the symbolic astronomical significance of the winter solstice. And that December the 25th is the first day after the winter solstice, when the length of the solstice means the sun is still. So during the 4 days of the solstice, from December the 21st through December the 24th, the length of the day does not increase nor decrease significantly. The sun is still as the earth tilts on its axis and begins to move in another direction. And so December the 25th is the first day when one can observe a significant increase in the amount of sunlight. It means to those African scientists that the sun, or God, was born on December the 25th, which means that you were guaranteed another year of life. So we got to see and understand the symbolism that was codified in this text in order to keep the masses of people away from the true source of power. It was said that 18 books were excluded from this new Christian Bible. These books can be found in a host of books, lost books of the Bible, the Apocrypha, and other texts. It's important to realize that at this Council of Nicea, they deleted references to astronomy, to astrology, numerology, symbolism, and metaphysics. Now, when I talk about astronomy, I'm not talking about the stuff that you read in newspapers about Leos and Scorpios. I'm not talking about that nonsense. I'm talking about the profound science that is related to the movement of celestial bodies around planet Earth and how they affect everything on planet Earth is affected by celestial bodies. The moon goes through its phases every 29 days. As the moon goes through its phases and reaches the full moon, you notice that during the time of the full moon, you have the highest tides during the time of the full moon. You have 2 high tides every day. What does that mean? It means that the electromagnetic energy, the gravitational energy from the moon is pulling all of the water on planet Earth towards it. That is what creates a high tide. Right? And so this water is being pulled toward the moon. And as the moon moves around the Earth, this bulge of water rotates around the Earth like the moon does. It literally moves around the Earth. So people who study astronomy study the effects that celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, the planets, and other stars have on all life on planet Earth. If the moon can pull the water in the oceans, in the streams, in the lakes, the moon is also pulling the air as well. The Earth is 70% water. And if the moon can pull the ocean, then what do you think the moon can do to the water that is within your body? You are 70% water. That is the reason why in the late 1800s, psychologists at an insane asylum in England coined the phrase lunacy to describe those people in the insane asylum who only seem to go crazy 3 or 4 days out of the month. And those days, those periods of insanity coincided with the full moon. Hence they were called lunatics. Luna from the Latin word luna meaning moon. They were affected by this electromagnetic gravitational effect of this one celestial body. There are hundreds of celestial bodies in the sky, sisters and brothers. And they affect us in more ways than we can imagine. So the science of astrology, astrologos, star knowledge, is the science of the understanding of these effects on everything on planet Earth. Not just the water, but the atmosphere, the plants. Every living thing is affected by these forces. It's important to realize that, well, let me just skip and move to the next point because I want to make some key points before time runs out. This whole concept of monotheism was said to have been formally introduced in Kemet by Akhenaten, who lived from 1353 to 1333 BCE. And according to a number of texts, it was believed that his chief priest was the personality that we call today Moses, who was a person from Kemet. And by the time Moses, this historical person named Moses, surfaces in Egypt, there were already 4 kings of Kemet with the suffix Moses in their name. There was Jehudi-Mes, or Tutmosis the first, Tutmosis the second, Tutmosis the third, Tutmosis the fourth. There was Ahmoses the first, Ahmoses the second. It's from the word, Kemetic word Ahmoses, that Hebrews derived the word Amos. Most of the names, according to Gary Greenberg in his book, The Moses Mystery, all of the names of the Hebrew patriarchs were derived from the names of Kemetic personalities. They used Kemetic history as the framework for fabricating this new text. It says in Acts 7, Acts chapter 7, verse 22, that Moses was learned in all of the wisdom of the Egyptians, and he was mighty in words and deeds, which meant that Moses went to school in Kemet, that he studied the priesthood in Kemet. And so the story gets a little quirky when Moses leaves, and he gives those who leave Kemet with them 10 commandments. But what we aren't taught is that he left 32 behind. In Kemet, they had 42 declarations of innocence. And if you compare the 42 declarations of innocence, the 42 admonitions of Ma'at, with the 10 commandments, you can see where these 10 commandments were derived. And what's significant is that in James Henry Breasted in Chicago at the Oriental Institute made this statement, I think back in the 40s, and he got in trouble when he said it, but it's true. James Henry Breasted did an account of personality known as Moses and the 10 Commandments, and showed how the 10 Commandments were derived from the 42 admonitions of Ma'at. And he said that you will notice that there is no commandment stating, thou shalt not lie. And as I like to remind people, if the people who taught us religion and taught us Christianity believed in just one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, we'd be having this conversation in Africa right now. Brother Smalls, at a lecture in Baltimore a couple of months ago, raised a point that I think was very significant. I want to share that with you now, that the significance of the Passover, we buy into these activities without really understanding their origin. The whole essence of the Passover is rooted in the last of the 10 plagues of Moses, where Moses said that the firstborn son of every Egyptian was going to die, and that the Jews were protected by putting blood on their doorstep. The spirit of death would bypass their homes so that the firstborn children in their households would not die. So every time you celebrate Passover, what you're celebrating is the death and the murder of tens of thousands of African children. No one has ever put it to you in this context. It's not very often that people talk about the murder, the death, the brutality that was issued out or meted out at the hands of Moses. I'll give you another example. Numbers 31. An Israeli war party comes back to Moses after having defeated an enemy, and they report to Moses that they killed all of the adult males. And Moses flew into a rage, and he sent them back to, and I quote now, to kill every woman who has slept with a man, to kill all of the boys, and save the virgins for yourselves. Now, what's honorable about that? There's nothing honorable about this behavior, about this language, but we've got to begin to read it with a different set of eyes in order to understand who this book is really about, or what aspects of this book we can use for ourselves. What's significant about the 42 admonitions of Ma'at is a scene that is one of my favorites, the scene of the weighing of the soul, where the heart of the deceased person stands before the scale of Ma'at, the scale of truth and justice and righteousness, and his soul, his heart is weighed on the scale of Ma'at. And it is at this scene where the soul of the deceased recites the 42 admonitions of Ma'at, declares their innocence. I have not stolen, I have not robbed, I have not defrauded offerings, I have not polluted myself, I have not polluted the land, I have not committed adultery, I have not committed murder, I have not committed crimes. And so it is a way that our ancestors understood that we had to be pure of heart in order to move through life. The 42 admonitions of Ma'at were not just so that your heart could be weighed favorably on the scale of justice at the time of your death, but it was designed specifically for you to live a meaningful life while you were here on planet Earth and cultivate meaningful relationships with the people that you were interacting with every day of your lives. So it was not just for death, it was for right now. Children were raised. They didn't have Sesame Street and all of this other nonsense. They were raised with Ma'at to understand the principles and concepts of Ma'at. So there was a different consciousness that emanated from these African people. It's important to realize, as Gerald Massey references in his Ancient Egypt, the Light of the World, parallels, the similarities between Heru and Jesus. Because you will find all of these personalities existed first in ancient Kemet. The earthly Jesus is equivalent to Heru. Jesus the Christ corresponds to Asar, the resurrected God. So he is a combination of the stories between Asar and Heru. Some of the early names for Heru in Kemet were the Prince of Peace. He was called the Good Shepherd. He was called the Lamb. He was called the Light of the World. He was called the Lord of Resurrection. He was called the Raiser of the Dead. He was called the Son of God, 4,000 years before Jesus. You can find symbols of Heru and his mother Aset throughout Europe. They're called shrines of the Black Madonna and Child. You'll find them in Spain. You'll find them in Russia. You'll find them in Paris. You'll find them in Poland. Pope John Paul II is Francesca Colba. That is where they have a major shrine of the Black Madonna. Every time he goes home to pray at the shrine of the Black Madonna. Many of these images of this black mother and child are kept in the basements or kept out of public view. Black faces. What's interesting, on the ones that are for public display, they would tell you these protracted stories of how these statues became black. There was a fire in the church in the 17th century, and the fire blackened just the face and the hands of the statue. It's really interesting the extent to which people will go through to try to camouflage the truth. What's also significant is that African spiritual traditions were copied by the Hebrews, and then the Greeks, and then the Italians, the Irish, the French, the German, everyone else. And then anytime you make a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, you lose sight of the original. And what you think is the real thing can't compare with the original. According to the World Christian Encyclopedia, as of 2001, there were over 33,800 different Christian denominations. And as of 1996, there were over 130 versions of the Bible. Now you've got this one story but all of these variations of this thing. Now, all of them can't be right. But do we question it? Do we ask who's right? What is the original source material? How was it changed? When was it changed? And what were the changes and how did they affect us? A version is defined as a change in form, a transformation, a conversion, a translation, or rendering. And according to Reverend Peter Goins, who is the Dean of Harvard School of Divinity and the author of a book entitled With Hand and Heart, he said that there are 66 books in the Bible, which were written by 66 different people over a period of 2,000 years. How do you reconcile that? 66 different people writing 66 different interpretations of something over a period of 2,000 years. So this book is not one book that was written by one person at a setting. You have to begin to understand where it came from. African spirituality taught that the powers of the Creator could be manifested within humans on earth. These new religious ideologies taught that man was conceived in sin and that the Son of God had to give his life for your salvation. They literally flipped the script, turned the world upside down. And throughout the years, numerous religious wars were waged as people fought to impose their interpretation of these sacred texts on the people that they conquered. As Europeans imposed Christianity throughout Europe, throughout Asia, they fought a variety of wars. There were 8 crusades, religious wars between Christians and Muslims, which took place between 1096 and 1291. The war against terrorism that George Bush talked about in his State of the Union address in January, he referred to the axis of evil, and this war can be considered as the 9th crusade. As a matter of fact, in his speech, he used this language, crusade. And there were a host of people who criticized him because it conjured up images of these 8 other crusades, wars between Christians and Muslims. So what we're dealing with now in this war of terrorism is nothing but a continuation of a war that has been going on for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, which has cost millions and millions of lives. All because of 2 groups of people battling each other for their concepts of God. It's important to realize that inquisitions were organized by the Roman Catholic Church to silence those who resisted their doctrines. They began with Constantine in 306 and lasted until the late 1500s. Christians who protested the dogma of the Roman Catholic Church and broke away called themselves Protestants or Protestants. They are comprised of Anglicans, Baptists, Lutherans, Mormons, and others. Those who broke away from the Roman Catholic Church. Let me just kind of go through a couple of things I want to share with you in terms of one of the significant changes took place in 1534 when King Henry VIII separated from the Vatican and decided that he was going to establish the Church of England. Felt that it was no longer necessary for him to receive orders from someone living hundreds and hundreds of miles away, that he was king of his domain. He was going to be responsible for the religious and spiritual directions of his people. And so he created a new church and a new religious ideology. And in this new religious ideology, he said that no women, no females, unless they were members of the noble class, were allowed to read their sacred book, their holy Bible. No apprentices, no journeymen, no laborers were permitted to read the Bible under penalty of death. So let's understand something about this book, the book that many of us grew up reading, the King James Version of the Bible, and understand something about what went into this book, what has come into our minds and our consciousnesses, and how it has affected our behavior. In 1604, King James authorized a committee of 50 scholars to write a uniform translation of the Bible. And by royal authority, all people, all citizens of England were bound to read his official version of the Holy Book only. You could be killed if you read another version of the Bible. And there's a minister, a friend of mine, said that this King James Version of the Bible is probably one of the most inaccurate versions ever written. But let me just share some information with you. See, I've gotten the 5-minute warning. So let me kind of bring some things to a close by sharing with you some information that I had originally published in the Browder file in the essay entitled Exploding the Myths, the piece on religion. It was one of the longest pieces, and it attracted the most interest or the most comments because of my discussion on religion, the African origins of the Bible, and how the Bible has been modified by others throughout the centuries. And specifically, what interested a number of people were the references that I made with regards to Shakespeare and the role that he played in writing this King James authorized version of the Bible. What's significant is that King James was 46 years old when this project of the King James version of the Bible was completed in 1610. And during that time, many artisans, painters, writers, sculptors were commissioned to do sacred work, but they were not allowed to put their signatures on them. And so many artists found very creative ways to write their name. They put it upside down, or they put it backwards, or they put it in the corner of a painting. Shakespeare found an equally creative way of inserting his name into the text. For example, if you look in Psalms 46, the third verse, the 46th word from the beginning of Psalms 46 is the word shake. The 46th word at the end of Psalms 46 and Psalms 46 verse 9 is the word spear. That is Shakespeare's signature in the Bible. Now, when I first referenced that in the book in '89, I received a lot of inquiries about people wanted to have some more information about that. So when I revised this book, I incorporated in the revision additional information, supplemental information about Shakespeare and his role in the Bible. As a matter of fact, one of the things that I did was I got maybe about a dozen different versions of the Bible. And I looked at Psalms 46 verse 3, Psalms 46 verse 9. And the King James Version of the Bible is the only version of the Bible where you will find the word shake, 46th word from the beginning of Psalms 46, and spear, the 46th word from the end of Psalms 46. So it's the only Bible where you find the strategic placement of these two words together that codify Shakespeare's involvement with this text. It's also important to realize that certain language in the Bible, thee, thou, ye, shall, this is Old English terminology. They didn't speak like that 2,000 years ago. But that is a language in the text. It's what I refer to as biblical sampling, where folk they borrow sacred text and incorporate it into their own. And let me just share just one more piece here about Shakespeare before I bring things to a close. With regards to Shakespeare, a little additional information about Shakespeare, who lived from 1546 to 1616, is still considered the greatest dramatist the world has ever known, the finest poet who has ever written in the English language. The World Book Encyclopedia said that Shakespeare originated such familiar phrases as fair play, foregone conclusion, catch cold, disgraceful conduct. He also invented such common words as assassination, bump, eventful, and lonely. Right? He was a writer of history. Shakespeare was primarily a writer of history, and he had a way of writing with such compassion that he was able to interest the common man in these stories. It's important to realize the impact that he has had on people throughout the ages, particularly in some of his other historical works. Much of what we know about Julius Caesar, Cleopatra, and Mark Antony was made up by William Shakespeare. Mark Antony never said, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. The whole story about the death and the suicide of Cleopatra and Mark Antony was made up by Shakespeare. So what I'm trying to get you all to understand is the extent to which information can be incorporated into text, and we accept it automatically without analyzing what this information is, who wrote it, and the impact that it had on us. So it's time to bring this to a close, unfortunately. And let me just leave you with this. The information that I share with you today, I hope will enable you to cultivate a meaningful relationship with the Creator. I hope you will begin to question everything. Seek answers to those who are responsible for giving you spiritual direction, and continue to look to Africa as the source of all spirituality. Study the ancient Kemetic texts. Read them, because we're at a point in time where the Bible is going to be replaced. Within the next 25 years, the Bible is going to be replaced. We have available to us sacred texts that can direct us and guide us. Sacred texts that were written by our ancestors that we have to begin to interpret, to translate for ourselves, and make our own sacred and holy Bibles. And I believe that when we do that, when, as the brother was saying, I'm closing now, as the brother was saying, you can expect, based on where this country is going right now, major economic, political, and social upheaval within the next 25 years. You can expect that, right? And as that is coming, you're also witnessing the deconstruction of religious systems. Catholic Church is literally disintegrating before your very eyes. And so we're going to need something to hold on to in times of trouble that are coming. Turn to your ancestral writings. I believe that you will find in those texts the knowledge that will help you move through the coming period of chaos, and will give you a greater sense of stability and spiritual direction. Thank you all very much.